Legal disclaimer here, I received a complimentary copy of the book Learning War by Trent from Naval Institute Press for content production. Welcome to another Military History Verbalized podcast, and today we have Trent, the author of Learning War, the evolution of fighting doctrine in the US Navy from 1898 to 1945. Welcome, Trent.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Could you give us a brief background on your expertise and what you've done before and what your job is?
Sure. So I have been fortunate to bring together two things. I have a day job. I work as a management consultant, helping organizations learn faster and get better at what they do. And then I am also a historian. So I have been writing and speaking, researching the U.S. Navy's doctrine, particularly in the early 20th century. I've written a number of different articles. The first one dating back to 2003 was published in the Journal of Military History. I was fortunate enough to have one that was in the Naval War College Review that won a few awards couple of years ago, and I have tied up the research from those different articles and encapsulated them in the book that you just referenced, which came out earlier this year from the United States Naval Institute, and I'm excited to talk more about it.
Excellent. So today we are focused only on one chapter, mainly the CRC, the Combat Information Center. To go a bit deeper, your book is about the evolution of fighting doctrine, and for me, 1 or 2 years ago, I tried to look into doctrine and find a proper definition or something. When I read into fleet tactics, everything, it was just, I think I started collecting definitions for it from different books. And so since your book is concerned with all this, what is your take on doctrine?
I think that is an excellent question. And your experience is not unusual. Doctrine can be a nebulous concept. Different organizations, different military forces define it in slightly different ways, even in different time periods. And one of the things that was challenging for me with the research was trying to get into the frame of mind that officers in the United States Navy had in the early 20th century. And I think they had a really useful definition of doctrine. They used it in two slightly different ways. They would talk about fleet doctrine. That's more like what we would think about today. What is the doctrine of the military force, the Navy, as an organization? But they would also use doctrine to talk about the specific set of guidance and instructions that a particular task force had. That was much more temporal. That is, it wouldn't last very long. It'd be very specific for a particular circumstance. And sometimes that terminology bled into and overlapped with what the Navy called plans, which were, the specific plan of battle that was going to be used for an upcoming fight. So thinking about the first one, the fleet-wide doctrinal definition, what I conceptualize it as is a set of mental models. It's the implicit and explicit assumptions that the officers are going to use to try to bring cohesion to their work as they go into battle, as they fight an enemy. And it's got to be sufficiently coherent so that they can act together, right? They have shared assumptions about what to do in particular circumstances, but also sufficiently flexible that they've got enough room to exercise their individual initiative towards the overall goals that they have. And this borrows quite heavily from the work of Dudley Knox, who was instrumental in crafting the Navy's first real doctrines in the period before the United States entered World War I and then immediately following and in the early 1919, 1920, that time frame. And I think it's a definition that a lot of people in the United States Navy at the time would have agreed with. The task force doctrine tends to get a lot more specific. It's, we're going to try to fight it at this kind of range. We're going to, open fire with our guns first and then use our torpedoes later. We're going to try to maneuver as a single unit, or maybe we're going to have a distributed task force that is cooperating. Those kinds of lower level doctrines tended to be a lot more instructional. But they were guiding towards the same end, which is let's give us all a shared picture, a shared set of assumptions, so that when we can't communicate, effectively when the battle is at hand and when we're trying to react to what the enemy is doing, we can act cohesively. We can act together.
So if I understand this correctly, basically one of the goals of a doctrine is to provide some guidelines, but not ones that are too rigid to kill initiative, but also good enough to have a good information flow going on, or not an information flow, a basic understanding that you don't have to explain everything, but not too rigid that the initiative is killed.
Exactly. Yes. That's exactly what it needs to be. And one of the terms that I use in the book, I borrow a lot of language from complexity theory. Is the idea of an enabling constraint. Right. You can have different kinds of constraints, and complexity constraints are like the rules around which people self-organize. And some of these can be very constrictive, and some of these can be can offer up more creativity. One of the examples I like to use, because a lot of us are familiar with these different paradigms, is traffic flow. So we've all come to a stoplight, and you have to stop at the stoplight, and you sit there and you wait until the light turns green. And that's a constraint, but it's a constraint that doesn't give you much flexibility. You follow the light. You don't have to think. But if we come to a traffic circle, and one of the things that I think is quite amusing is, in general, my fellow citizens of the United States are not very good at negotiating traffic circles. But anyway, when I've driven around them in Europe or New Zealand or other places like that, they can be very exciting because you have to negotiate with the rest of the traffic. You have to understand what the rules are. But the flow can be much better and much more dynamic than a traffic light. So I like that example.
Yeah, that's a very good example, because when I did my driver's license, we basically had nearly none, or they just introduced them, and now I can see the benefits, because initially I think we also were in Austria. What is with these circles? It doesn't make sense. So in another way, to a certain degree, one could see doctrine a little bit like oil. If it's too, you need the right amount, and it must be the correct one. If it's too much, you break the engine. If you have not enough, you have too much friction.
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. I like that because you could also think about different grades of oil for different temperatures or different operating conditions. Yeah, that's good.
I was thinking about this because I previously had one. I think I was thinking about sand and filling up the spaces between the bricks or something. This was the first one I had a few years ago, but this is not flexible enough. And also sand usually is not a positive association.
Well, certainly not when you think about engines.
Yeah, definitely not. Back then it was also a building, but a building is also static, and the engine, it's more dynamic, and it's a lot about dynamics from what I read so far. So let's go to the Combat Information Center. My first association when I read about it, for me, it was it's like a real-time general staff. And that furthermore then took on, when it developed more like commanding or more initiative, like giving the command to fire early on and not sometimes waiting for the captain. I think there was one example against the torpedo bomber attacks during night where the initiative was then from the CRC. What do you think about this view of mine as a layman?
There's a lot in what you just said. Let me react first to the idea of a real-time general staff. I think that is a wonderful conceptualization because a good CIC is going to fulfill some of the same functions as a staff. A CIC is a sense-making organization. So let me backtrack a little bit and talk about some of the history. One of the things that the U.S. Navy discovers in the early years, or at least the early years of the American involvement of World War II, is that there's too much information that is now available to ship captains and formation commanders because the Navy has introduced radars. There is a new very high frequency radio set that allows ships to communicate in real time. And a lot of the fighting is at night, so it's very hard to see very far with eyes, although there are lots of reports that come in from lookouts. And so captains and formation commanders have been accustomed to trying to keep track of all this information in their head, to synthesize it rapidly and then act on it. And there's just too much of it now. They can't do that. And so what a good staff will do, right, is evaluate available information, explore different alternatives, challenge the assumptions of a commander so that a military force can make the best decision. Ideally, that's what a staff should be doing. So conceptualizing this combat information center as a real-time staff, I think is a pretty good analogy, because what's going on is something very similar. The combat information center is taking all that information from the various sources, assessing it and analyzing it as rapidly as possible in real time, and providing actionable information to the ship or formation commander so that he, and it was he during all this time, could make that decision. That makes a lot of good sense. I like that conceptualization because it captures it very well. Now, you made reference to torpedo plane attacks. One of the things that the Japanese learned, right? So the CIC gets very good at analyzing, disseminating this information, and allowing the ship commander to act on it. The Japanese discovered that if they hovered at a certain range, or orbited, hover's the wrong word, right? Because they have airplanes. They're orbiting at a certain range outside of really the effective distance of the U.S. ships' anti-aircraft fire at night. And they would orbit in that formation. And then periodically, one of the planes would separate from that formation and come in for an attack. And they would do this one at a time because it was difficult to detect that movement of the one plane around out of the orbiting group. And so they discovered that if they did this, they could get inside the decision loop of the Combat Information Center to the ship commander, to the order to fire the guns. And they could get on an attack before being shot down. So the adjustment that the American ships made was, well, let's not pass the information from the CIC to the ship commander. Let's just have the CIC order, because they have detected this incoming plane. Let's just have them order the guns to open fire, and not wait for putting the commander in the loop. So one of the things that I think is quite interesting about that is it shows how, initially the Combat Information Center was just this augmentation function. And then they allow it, if you think of it as a real-time staff, they allow this real-time staff to assume more decision-making capability, more initiative, so that they can make decisions even faster. And in this example, shoot down those incoming torpedo planes before they could reach the launch point. It's very interesting.
So we talked a bit about the Combat Information Center. What can we assume this? I read a bit. This is like it's more or less a room, and then there's certain rules at certain points established that at one point that the people are there and there. So for people who don't have any idea, how would you describe a Combat Information Center early on? How it looked more or less, or what we can imagine?
Well, early on, one of the things that's very interesting is early on there's a lot of variability and flexibility. Different ships would do this in different ways. Some of the first ones were just an officer, like the executive officer or someone else, looking at a PPI, a plan position indicator radar screen. That's the radar screen that most of us are all familiar with now, that is a top-down view with the radar in the center, and then potential targets as blips around the outside.
And also the geography, right?
Right. So that's very, very simple. It doesn't have as much capability. The officer monitoring that screen has to keep a sense of what's going on in his head. As time went on, they began to develop more regimental layouts of what the CIC would look like. There was a lot of experimentation to figure this out. And one of the things that they decided upon was to have it divided up basically into 4 quadrants. So at the fore part of the ship, they would have plots. And a plot is it's like a top-down view, but it's been done with a grease pencil so that you can visualize not just what the radar might be showing you right now, but what it has shown you in the past. So you could track the relative motions of potential enemy ships or enemy planes. Ships tended to be on, the surface contacts would be on the port side of the ship, and aerial contacts would be on the starboard side. That would be in the fore part of the CIC. And then the other 2 quadrants in the aft part would be real time. So radar displays, again, surface ships or surface contacts to port and aerial contacts to starboard. And this way you had a real time section and then a historical section. And all of this would be bubbling up into the officer called the evaluator, who was responsible for monitoring everything that was going on in the CIC and then providing the actionable information to the ship or formation commander and also to the weapons of the ship.
Okay, so basically the plot is basically a timeline of the position.
Yes, yes. So it gives you a sense of how rapidly some of the potential contacts are moving. So you could tell whether or not like an aerial group of enemy planes was coming at you or potentially coming at some other part of the formation and take action accordingly. The same with potential surface contacts, right? If they've just executed a very rapid and coordinated turn away, then maybe they've just fired torpedoes and you need to take evasive action.
So can I imagine you mentioned these quadrants, and is everything, these plots and also real-time information, can you see it from one position, or do you have move or more or less? I mean, of course, it depends on the ships because these are small and everything.
That's the intent. So oftentimes the evaluator would stand in such a position in the forward part so that he could see the plots and in such a position so that he could see the surface plot and the aerial plot and make sense of them both together, and then very quickly be able to synthesize that information and provide details to the captain. Different ships experimented with different approaches. So one of the things that you see fairly commonly in pictures is particularly on carrier CICs, there will be a vertical plot, a large glass or wall essentially, and some of the men who are manning the CIC are writing on that, but they're writing on it in reverse, so that people on the opposite side can quickly see that and make sense of it and read what they write. I think that would be quite a challenge to be able to write quickly in reverse so that it's legible to someone else. I'm glad I never had to do that.
Yeah, I can't even write normally that somebody else can read it. And I was just thinking about it, doing that. It's like, okay, I never could do that job. Okay. Can you write that somebody can read it reverse? Not even normally. About the evaluator, did he provide the information proactively to the captain, or was he more like he was getting called upon for information?
Ideally, proactively, right? Because the situation is dynamically changing, and he wants to make sure that the captain or the formation commander is well informed. So, regular updates should be provided, and especially any time that the circumstances are dynamic or changing. It was very important that the captain and the evaluator have a good working relationship, so they get a sense of each other. They become a team. They know how to work together. I think this is one of the things that is also very interesting to me. I mentioned there was experimentation. There were different setups for the Combat Information Centers early on. I think what you see also is a lot of experimentation with, how should this work? What is the best choice in terms of who should be the evaluator? Ultimately, they settled on different ship types had different recommended officers for the evaluator. Destroyers, it was generally the executive officer. Battleships, the executive officer already had a designated role as the officer in charge of the secondary conning station, ready to take over in case there was any casualty to the first. So it had to be someone else. And I think battleships, if I remember right, had flexibility in picking who that officer would be. So there's very, very important choices there. And I think you can see from the performance of different ships, sometimes, the evaluator does a pretty good job and sometimes not. I note in the book that one of the destroyers at the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, the Combat Information Center becomes confused and ultimately identifies the Japanese cruisers as friendly ships, so that ship misses an opportunity to make a torpedo attack on them from relatively close range. Part of that problem was because the Combat Information Center was several decks below the bridge, so when the Combat Information Center sort of lost a sense of what was going on, the captain went down to see what was going on, and it takes several minutes to transit up and down the ladders. And from, one of their recommendations out of that was, put the CIC at the same level as the bridge, so that if there's any confusion, if there's any problem between that evaluator captain interface, the captain can very quickly go to the CIC and see for himself what is going on.
Now, for 1943, you mentioned the Japanese didn't have any equivalent to the CIC. Did they over the 44 and 45 develop something similar?
I don't think so. I think that they are still more akin to an earlier variant. So the Combat Information Center, as I said, is like a very rapid real-time sense-making organization. You called it like a real-time staff. And I think the Japanese are still wedded more towards more traditional staff approach for their ship handling, which, the Navy had radar plots before the CIC. The difference is that they're not able to first, gather all the information as rapidly, and then second, make sense of it. It's more, well, here's the information. The captain will have to come and check it out, and use that to foster his decision making. And I think the Japanese were closer to that. One of the I think effective signs of that, or indications of some of the challenges that the Japanese had later in the war, is their operations at Surigao Strait, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Right, they have a formation that comes up the strait, and it's attacked by a series of American destroyers on its way north. And the Japanese appear confused through most of this. They don't seem to be able to identify where the American attacks are coming from, and they sail right into the American battle line at the end of the strait, seemingly unaware of the fate that is awaiting them. And so, although they did have some radars, they don't seem to have been terribly effective, and they don't seem to have been very good at assessing or analyzing the information that they might have provided.
For me, the question would be why the Japanese didn't do this, and now I'm speculating, so be careful. I mean, I know that the Japanese had an extremely high training standard before the war, which of course deteriorated usually with nearly all Axis nations because they took heavy losses and couldn't replace them fast enough, whereas the Allies usually caught up with the training rather fast. And I mean, they also lacked to a certain degree radar. So could it be that the Japanese never had this information overflow to such a degree like the US Navy had? And so they tried to gradually deal with it, whereas the US Navy at a certain point with radar and all the other information coming in was just overloaded, and they said, okay, we need something new to deal with this. We have a real challenge here.
I think that that's an interesting hypothesis. One of the things that I do know is that the Japanese were much more successful at maintaining their organizational structure, right? So one of the challenges that the United States Navy faced is they had pre-war organizations, destroyer squadrons and cruiser divisions and the like. And they had assumed that during the war, those would be relatively stable, and that the familiarity that developed between those ships and their commanding officers would lend some cohesion in battle. That assumption doesn't hold true. The pressures of a war in the Atlantic and the Pacific simultaneously force the U.S. Navy to sort of redistribute ships and men in a much more ad hoc fashion. The Japanese maintain much more coherence to their formations. So one of the reasons that they perform better in a lot of the early night battles is because they have some greater coherence there. They don't face the same kinds of challenges that the United States Navy does. Another thing that appears to have happened, I have less evidence about what was actually going on with the Japanese because I haven't been able to consult the primary sources. I don't speak Japanese, which is part of the problem, is they seem to have been less interested in gathering lessons. So one of their destroyer captains, his name is Hara. His memories of the war are translated in a book called Japanese Destroyer Captain. And one of the things that he notes there is after he's been in a series of night battles, he comes back to a base, and his destroyer survived, and he and his crew are just sort of shuttled off. There's no effort to try to bring him back to meet with his staff or any other command structure so that he can share the lessons that he's learned, the skills that he and his crew have developed to ensure the survival of his ship. So there's no institutional pattern of gathering combat experience and then learning from that. It's not to say that the Japanese didn't do it. I mean, obviously they learned and they evolved their tactics, but Hara's experience suggests that approach was less systemic than what the United States Navy was instituting, particularly in the Pacific Fleet under Admiral Nimitz, where there was and this is one of the points that I make, there was an institutionalized pattern of trying to learn from experience. And I think that's one of the things that allowed the United States Navy to come up with the CIC and adjust to what was being learned during the war.
Yeah, I mean, this is my impression, and it's a cultural impression, so very, very, very dangerous and maybe politically incorrect. The United States in general has a very open and positive approach to information flow. I mean, you can see it. I use a lot of sources, United States Army or US Marine Corps publications, because they're public domain. Whereas in other countries, it's basically sometimes insane to get these, or no chance at all. And sometimes after 50 years, they are not declassified yet. And in the United States, you get, here's a field manual from 2011, public domain.
Yeah.
It's like, okay. And in Germany, for instance, the Bundesarchiv, the Federal Archive, they put out a lot of images, but they're under the share alike license, which means if I use them, I have to adopt the same license they have.
Oh, yes, right.
So basically, it's one could say enforced communism to a certain degree. And I have to put 20 hours in a video, and then I have to use the same license they used on a picture of a Tiger tank from World War II. They put no effort into it. It's like, I can't use this picture because everyone else can use my video then. So.
All right.
This is very interesting for me to see this, all the field manuals, also from Second World War, digitized and everything. From Germany, I have to buy them from second-hand bookstores or something. So very different. It's the same with the free speech. With the United States, I think is really good in gathering information and also getting talent. In Europe, I only can see a brain drain going on, and it always goes to the United States. For the complete 20th century, you're really good at sucking up all the brain juice from Europe and everything else.
That's a very interesting perspective. Yeah. I think there is some truth to the idea that there is, and I start the book with a discussion of what was going on in the late 19th century in terms of the United States Navy and its transition to a professional organization. And I think that is part of it. The officers of that time were spending a lot of time trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a professional naval officer? What is this? What is naval strategy? What does it mean to us as Americans? And they're wrestling with that question, but they're doing it in a very American way. You've highlighted the openness of information. That is, I think, an American characteristic. Something else that was that they struggled with was the importance that American politicians placed on the idea of civilian control. Right. So one of the things they want to do, the officers at this time, is they want a naval general staff, and they'd like to have something akin to what the Prussians had developed before the war with France in 1870. And the American, congressmen and senators, they'll have none of that, because that to them was a potential subversion of the idea of civilian control. And so the mechanisms that the United States Navy comes up with are an interesting marriage of the desire to have greater military authority over planning and preparing for war, but at the same time respect the fact that in the United States, the civilian government has to remain ultimately in control. So two of the things that get invented are the General Board, which comes about in 1900, and then the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, which is initially authorized in 1915, and then is strengthened in 1916 after it proves its worth. So I'm not sure exactly how that relates to the openness of information, but I do think that the characteristics of the American nation are an interesting part of the story.
Yeah, this is kind of related. If you look at it, Prussia was mainly a land power, whereas United States, I would say, is a land power, but it predominantly is a sea power, because you have to cross the Atlantic or the Pacific to attack it, unless you're Canada or Mexico, which is less of a threat than like for Prussia, Austria, France, Russia, and everyone else. So, and this military historian Gerhard Gross, he points out that he made the comparison with Prussia, Germany, and United Kingdom, because he sees conscription to a certain degree was a necessity for land powers, because they have a very limited amount of time to get the war machine going. Whereas a sea power is always, it's a long duration. I mean, also naval strategy, as one of my professors said, is build strategy. You're talking years, sometimes decades, to build up a fleet and everything. So, for instance, there's less of a necessity to a certain degree for a general staff if you're sitting on between two oceans. In this context, because there's less of a necessity and threat from the outside, that you can say, okay, you can actually afford this. Whereas, for instance, Germany or the Prussians were always concerned about two-front war. It's like, I mean, sometimes you could say it's protection because they were quite aggressive as well. So it's always like, for me as an Austrian, it's always like Germany, the force in the middle, and I look at the map, and I mean, it really depends on what time you look at the map, but Austria is usually in the center of Europe, and Germany is to the north of Europe. At least they have the Baltic Sea, yeah, because okay, there's not much here. I think we are the guys in the center, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that is fascinating. I know less about it, but one of the things that I think is very interesting about Germany's history is there is this very legitimate, I'd say, fear of getting caught in two front wars through the course of the 20th century, and yet Germany manages to start two front wars.
I mean, usually they extend it to a multi-front war rather fast to evade a two-front war.
Right.
We don't like a two-front war. Okay, let's make it at least three then, okay?
Yeah, two's the wrong number. Let's make it three.
But back to the CIC, nearly the whole chapter was focused on night combat. And I know that the Japanese were extremely well trained on night combat from the very get-go. So to a certain degree, it could also be that the CIC helped bridge the gap in the experience the Japanese had in night combat against the US Navy?
It's a reaction to it, absolutely. And bridging the gap, that's an interesting way to put it. One of the things that I've tried to show with my research, both before the book and then in the book itself, is that there's an assumption based on an examination of what happened during the war and an inadequate look at what was going on before the war. And the assumption is that the United States Navy didn't prepare adequately for night combat. And I think that's slightly, that needs to be modified. I think it has some truth to it, but there was a lot of preparation that went on for night combat. It's tailored or adjusted by virtue of the fact that the Navy was assuming that night combat would take place as part of a major fleet action. So there was an emphasis on nocturnal destroyer attacks, or let's not just destroyers, but destroyers supported by cruisers against an enemy formation, or repulsing that kind of attack coming against the Navy's formation. So the large exercises of the 1920s and 30s, particularly the 30s, the fleet problems, a lot of them had a part that focused on that. That was trying to explore how they could best protect the fleet at night, or how they could best attack a Japanese formation at night. So there's a lot of planning and thought that goes into this, and some more sophisticated techniques developed. One of the things that assumption, it unfortunately anchors the thinking of the United States Navy. They begin to think about destroyer attacks as something that's going to come after you fight your way through an enemy screen. That is, so you have to use your guns first to blow past enemy destroyers or cruisers that are escorting the battleships or other large ships at the center of the formation, and then you can get close enough to fire your torpedoes. So there's an overemphasis on using gunfire first and then torpedoes second. And so the U.S. Navy's tactics emphasize this use of gunfire and subordinate the use of stealthy torpedo attacks. The Japanese, bit different. And you see it at the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942. The Japanese are very skilled at, sighting the enemy, opening fire with torpedoes, and then holding their fire with their guns until about the time that the torpedoes would arrive at the target. So essentially what you get at the target is this simultaneous barrage of torpedoes and gunfire erupting. And it's really devastating, especially when you consider the fact that the Japanese had invested in very large, powerful, long-range torpedoes that were seen as their counter to the fact that they weren't allowed by treaty to have as many battleships. And so the combination of these very powerful torpedoes and their effective use of stealth is what makes them so very effective. And so the Americans have to shift their thinking. They have to get out of this, we're going to use our guns first. They have to begin to think about how they could return to stealthy torpedo attacks. And it's not until the middle of 1943 that they really begin to embrace that. They're thinking about it in late 1942. Ideally, the battle plan for the Battle of Tassofaranga is supposed to work that way, but the American destroyers don't unleash their torpedoes at the right time, and it doesn't work out.
Now, we already talked about the Japanese Navy not having a CIC. How about the Royal Navy? Was there something similar there?
Yes. And there's a lot of information sharing that goes back and forth. The Royal Navy has something they call the Action Information Organization, which essentially is a CIC. And I know less about its evolution and its history, but a lot has been written about the effective techniques that the British developed to coordinate their aerial formations at the Battle of Britain. Right, they have a coordinated network to manage those aircraft, and so they use similar techniques for carriers, and that information finds its way to the United States Navy, and that influences how the U.S. Navy is doing its fighter direction with its carriers. And then at the same time, the Royal Navy is developing this sort of surface technique, Action Information Organization, which is like the equivalent of an American CIC, to keep track of how its surface ships operate and coordinate their movements. The British seem to have been very effective at it. One of the advantages that they have is they have also invested, not unlike the Japanese, a lot in night combat. I think some of this, I'm less familiar with the primary records, but I believe a lot of this results from their belief that it would be, they could have been more effective at Jutland if they had been able to fight as a fleet at night after the main fleet action. And so in the interwar period, they think about how they might do that. They're also reacting to the fact that their battle line, also restricted by treaty, is a bit older and less capable than some of the other nations of the world, like the Japanese. They think they'll be able to fight at night better than the Japanese. And so they deliberately plan for night action. And you can see the effects of some of that with some of the fighting against the Italians in the Mediterranean.
About the Italians and Kriegsmarine.
I don't think they had an equivalent. I think they're more akin to what the Japanese had developed, which is a reliance on older plots and so on. The Germans did make effective use of radar, at least for fire control. I'm not sure how well they utilized it in terms of making sense of the situation in real time with search radars and the like.
Do you have anything to add before I have my final question?
Well, this has been a very pleasant conversation, so I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity, and I do just want to say, I know we've been focused on the Combat Information Center. I think anybody who is interested in how the U.S. Navy organized itself to fight effectively through the course of the two world wars would probably find the material in my book interesting. It's got a heavy slant towards doctrine, as we've discussed, and also learning and how you evolve doctrine in order to get better. So I'd encourage your listeners to check it out if they're interested.
I can definitely recommend it. I must add here, I received a free copy from Naval Institute Press, so I might be biased, and I need to mention this. So I also very much enjoyed this conversation. And now I have my final question, because you noted in the conclusion of your CSE chapter that it was a revolution. And from basically everything I read of history and military history in the last 2 years and what I heard, nearly every historian nowadays stretches that everything that was previously a revolution was just an evolution. Maybe there was some exception, I missed it. So what is your take on this? Was it really a revolution? Was it an evolution? Or
Well, first, I think that these are very These are very loaded terms. They have a lot of meaning. So earlier we talked about doctrine, and you explained how it can mean different things to different organizations at different times and different people. And I think evolution and revolution are facing something similar. I believe that there's been a bit of a backlash to the revolution in military affairs, as it was called. And that thinking that that it's always got to be something new. So I think the trend towards calling things evolution is to some degree probably a response to that. I very deliberately call the CIC and some of the other things, these innovations that the Navy went through, revolutionary, because I do think that they are introductions of something that can transform an organization's approach. And so for me, that's kind of the definition of revolution. Is it a transformative step that really changes how an organization approaches and thinks about the problems that it faces? And I think the CIC is a great example of that, because it is a shift in organizational structure that has to occur in order to fully realize the advantage of a new technology. In this case, we're talking about radar, but information from more than just radars comes into a CIC. Destroyer CICs are also dealing with sonar, and all these new radio communications that are coming in. So to take advantage of those new technologies, to really make them effective, a new information processing organization had to be created within the ship or within the force, because the Navy moved from just having CICs aboard a ship to having a task force CIC that was a network of the CICs within the task force. And so to realize the advantages that those new technologies offer, you have to have this change in organization, a change in the human interface to the technology, and that's what the CIC represents. And so I would argue that it is revolutionary because it fundamentally changes how, in this case, the U.S. Navy goes about dealing with that. And I think it gives it a significant advantage, particularly in the Pacific in its battles against the Japanese in the latter half of World War II. So that's my answer. And I'm happy for people to come at that and criticize it, because I think we'll all learn something from the exercise.
So when I understand it correctly, so it had a revolutionary impact.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Okay, this is I think this is very interesting to look at it this way, because from what usually they argue is that, for instance, Stoßtrupptaktik or what is usually called Blitzkrieg, which I call Bewegungskrieg, this was there all the time. It developed slowly, and then the impact was also revolutionary, but the development was evolutionary. So for the CIC, what was before the CIC?
Before the CIC, you have more traditional plots. So for the Navy, for example, you had a radar plot. And one of the things that in early CIC communications, I forget whether it's I think it's from the destroyer type command in the Pacific Fleet, says, this is not just a new radar plot. This is a fundamental change in how we manage information. So they're contrasting what came before with what is now. And so we've talked about some of the things that make it different. The CIC is more real time. The CIC is all shipboard information consolidating and coming together, not just from a particular technology or information source. And it's synthesized in such a way that the officer in charge, the evaluator, can make sense of it and provide actionable information to the command structure. So those are some things that make it different. And that's what came before, a more traditional plotting organization that placed more burden on the ship captain.
I'm torn. I can't. I don't know enough. It could actually be a revolutionary, not just from the impact, also from the development, because there was so many stuff going on. Because if you look, for instance, with the Germans with mobile warfare or something, they always did it. They were always focused on the movement, and the tank just enabled that at this point. And then the organization, the Panzer Division, that everything processes with the same speed. But if you look back at Napoleon, he did already this with horse cavalry, for instance. So in that sense,
sure.
So for that case, it's sometimes, yeah, it really depends how you argue, because if you look at the impact, it quite often is revolutionary. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're making a really really good point, which is that there are these evolutionary steps. There are these gradual incremental changes, and there are moments when enough of these come together to create a differentiation, and I think the German tactics, the blitzkrieg that you cite, is akin to that. Yes. So everything that feeds into that has been done before. You can cite Napoleon's tactics and see the antecedents, but the way that gets put together in 1939, 1940, even the opening campaign in Russia, is really shocking and transformational in a lot of ways. So I think the argument, we can get lost in, is it evolution or is it revolution? But I think what that can lead us to is a deeper understanding of how all these changes can come together to make something that gives one force a decided advantage in a moment in time. And I think that's one of the things that the militaries are trying to capture, right? How do you gain that momentary advantage that gives you enough time to win a campaign or a war?
And thank you very much for this great talk.
Thank you. This has been very, very enjoyable. I really appreciate it.